Part 1. The Days That Were. The autumn leaves in Millbrook, Illinois had always reminded Charlotte of Caleb's highs, warm amber catching the last rays of September sun. She remembered this as she sat in her tiny studio apartment near Northwestern University, 3 months after he'd left for Paris. The memory felt both vivid and impossibly distant, like looking at photographs of someone else's life. Their story had begun in the most ordinary way, in the hallways of Millbrook High, where teenage dreams felt as vast as the cornfields that stretched beyond the town limits. Charlotte had been the girl who painted watercolor landscapes in the art room during lunch, while Caleb was the one who wrote for the school newspaper and talked passionately about documentary filmmaking. She could still feel the nervous flutter in her stomach from that first October afternoon when he'd approached her easel, his shadow falling across her half-finished painting of the old miller's barn. "The way you capture light," he'd said, his voice uncertain but sincere, "it's like you're painting time itself." Charlotte had looked up from her palette, a dab of ochre on her thumb, and found herself lost in the earnest intensity of his gaze. Even then, at 17, Caleb possessed this quality of complete presence. When he looked at you, you felt like the only person in the world. "Time is just light moving," she'd replied, surprising herself with the philosophical turn. "Or maybe light is time standing still." He'd smiled then, that slow, considered smile that would become as familiar to her as her own reflection. "I'd like to make a film about that someday, about how artists see time differently." That conversation had stretched into autumn afternoons spent walking the tree-lined streets of their small town, their breath visible in the cooling air as they debated everything from Monet's haystacks to the ethics of documentary photography. Charlotte found in Caleb not just a boyfriend, but a kindred spirit, someone who understood that beauty wasn't just in the grand gestures, but in the quiet moments between heartbeats. Their senior year had unfolded like a gentle dream. Caleb would pick her up in his father's old Buick, and they'd drive to the hill overlooking town, where Charlotte would sketch the distant skyline while Caleb edited footage on his laptop. Sometimes they'd barely speak for hours, comfortable in their shared silence, the only sounds the scratch of charcoal on paper and the soft clicking of his keyboard. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he'd asked one evening in May, as they watched the sunset behind the grain elevator that marked the center of their small world. Charlotte had considered this, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. "I think about going places," she'd said carefully, "but leaving feels different from going, like you're running away from something instead of running toward it." Caleb had been quiet for a long moment, picking at the grass beside their blanket. "I got into Northwestern, communications program, and there's this exchange opportunity in Paris for junior year." The words hung between them in the golden air, heavy with implication. Charlotte had kept sketching, though her hand had trembled slightly. "That's wonderful," she managed, even as something cold and sharp twisted in her chest. "You've always talked about wanting to study in Europe." "What about us?" he'd asked, and the vulnerability in his voice had made her look up from her drawing. "What about us?" she had echoed, but gently. "Caleb, this is your dream, and I have mine too. I got into the Art Institute in Chicago, remember?" They'd made promises that night, sitting under the emerging stars of their Illinois sky. They'd stay together through college, they'd visit each other, they'd make it work. When Caleb eventually went to Paris, they'd write letters, real letters, not just texts. And they'd talk every week. Distance would just be geography, nothing more. Charlotte smiled now, remembering their naive certainty. At 18, love had seemed like the one constant in a world of variables, the thing that would remain unchanged while everything else shifted around them. Their first 2 years of college tested that belief, but not broken it. Northwestern was only an hour from the Art Institute, close enough for weekend visits and study dates in Chicago coffee shops. Charlotte threw herself into her studies, exploring everything from classical techniques to contemporary installation art. She loved the way paint responded to her touch, the way she could layer color and texture to create something that had never existed before. Caleb flourished too, in his element among other aspiring storytellers and media creators. He'd call Charlotte after his film theory classes, excited about some new concept or technique he'd learned. "We watched this Truffaut film today," he'd tell her, his voice bright with enthusiasm. "The way he uses natural light reminds me of your paintings. There's this scene." And Charlotte would listen, curled up in her narrow dorm bed, picturing his animated gestures as he spoke. She loved his passion, the way his mind made connections across disciplines and cultures. It was one of the things that had drawn to him in the first place, this sense that he saw the world not as separate fragments, but as an interconnected whole. The acceptance letter from the Paris exchange program had arrived on a Tuesday in February, during Chicago's cruelest month, when the lake-effect snow piled in gray drifts along Michigan Avenue. Charlotte had been in her color theory class when Caleb called, his voice crackling through the poor phone connection in the art building's basement. "I got it," he'd said, and she'd known immediately what he meant. "The Paris program. I leave in September." Charlotte had excused herself from class, stepping into the hallway where her words wouldn't echo off tile walls. "That's incredible," she'd said, and meant it, even as something cold and sharp twisted in her chest. "Tell me everything." He'd talked for 20 minutes about the program, about the courses he'd take at Sciences Po, about the internship possibilities at French production companies. Charlotte had listened, making appropriate sounds of excitement and pride, while watching her classmates move past her in the corridor, like fish in an aquarium, their lives continuing in their predictable patterns, while hers felt suddenly unmoored. "It's only a year," Caleb had said toward the end of the call, as if sensing her unspoken fears. "And maybe you could visit. There are artist residencies in Paris, summer programs." "Maybe," Charlotte had agreed, though her scholarship barely covered her expenses in Chicago. Paris felt as distant and impossible as the moon. That night, she'd sat in her studio space long after the other students had gone home, staring at a canvas she'd been working on, a landscape of the Illinois prairie in winter, all muted browns and grays with just a hint of gold where the grass caught the light. She'd been trying to capture the feeling of vastness, of possibility, but now the painting looked flat and lifeless to her eyes. She'd picked up her brush, loaded it with ultramarine blue, and painted a single figure in the distance, walking away toward the horizon. It was a tiny detail, barely visible, but it changed the entire mood of the piece. Instead of empty possibility, the prairie now felt abandoned, lonely. The months between February and September passed in a strange suspension. Charlotte and Caleb continued their routines, weekend visits, long phone calls, planning for the future, but there was an undercurrent of ending in everything they did. They were like actors, performing roles they'd outgrown, going through the motions of a relationship that was already beginning to shift into memory. The night before Caleb left for Paris, they'd driven back to their old spot overlooking Millbrook. The town looked smaller from the hill, its few streetlights like scattered stars in a vast darkness. Charlotte had brought her sketchbook, but she hadn't drawn. Instead, they'd lain on their backs on the old blanket, looking up at the real stars and talking about everything except his departure. "Do you remember," Caleb had said, his hand finding hers in the darkness, "that first day when you said time is just light moving?" Charlotte had hummed in acknowledgement. "I think you were right, and I think what we've had here these 4 years, it's like a perfect photograph. It's captured something real, something that won't change, even when everything else does." Charlotte had turned her head to look at him, his profile silver in the starlight. "That's very poetic." "I mean it, though. What we have, it's not going anywhere." She'd wanted to believe him. Part of her did believe him. But another part, the artist's part, that noticed shadows and light and the spaces between things, had already begun to understand that love, like light, could change when it moved through different mediums. What seemed brilliant and clear in the familiar atmosphere of Illinois might refract differently in the denser air of Paris, splitting into constituent colors they'd never seen before. They'd made love that night with a tenderness that bordered on desperation, as if they could somehow imprint themselves on each other deeply enough to withstand the coming separation. Afterward, Charlotte had lain awake listening to Caleb's breathing settle into sleep, memorizing the weight of his arm across her waist, the way he always curled slightly toward her in unconscious seeking. At the airport the next day, surrounded by the harsh fluorescent lighting and constant announcements, their goodbye had been surprisingly brief. They'd said everything already, made all the promises, laid out all the plans for staying in touch. The actual moment of parting was just logistics. A hug, a kiss, a whispered "I love you," lost in the ambient noise of travelers and departure announcements. Charlotte had watched his plane taxi toward the runway from the observation area, a white and blue speck growing smaller against the gray September sky. She'd stayed until she could no longer distinguish it from the other aircraft, then driven home through the familiar streets of her childhood, feeling like she was seeing them for the first time. Now, 3 months later, she could trace the evolution of their separation in the letters scattered across her desk. Caleb's early communications had been full of excitement and detailed descriptions: the narrow streets of the Latin Quarter, the view from his tiny apartment near the Pantheon, the intensity of his classes conducted entirely in French. October 15th. Dear Charlotte, you wouldn't believe this city. Every corner looks like something from a film. Actually, like something from multiple films, all layered on top of each other. I keep expecting to see Audrey Hepburn walking up from the scene, or Jean-Luc Godard to appear from behind a cafe with his camera. His enthusiasm had been infectious, even through paper and ink. Charlotte had found herself researching the neighborhoods he mentioned, looking up the films he referenced, trying to see Paris through his eyes. She'd written back with equal detail about her own life, her new painting techniques, the way Chicago looked from the Art Institute's windows, the small discoveries of her daily routine. October 22nd. Dear Caleb, I've been working on a series of urban landscapes, trying to capture the way morning light hits the buildings across from my studio. There's something about the way the shadows move across brick and glass that reminds me of your description of late afternoon in the Marais. Do you think light has a different quality in different cities, or do we just see it differently because we're different people in different places? But gradually, subtly, the tone of his letters had begun to shift. The descriptions became less detailed, more hurried. He wrote about new friends, about the sophisticated conversations in his seminars, about opportunities that might extend beyond his year abroad. Between the lines, Charlotte began to sense a growing distance that had nothing to do with geography. Her own letters, in response, had become more careful, more consciously cheerful. She'd started editing out the loneliness, the moments of doubt, the way she sometimes caught herself listening for his voice in crowded rooms. She'd written about her art, her classes, her life in Chicago as if it were perfectly fulfilling, complete in itself. November 30th. Dear Caleb, I'm sorry it's been so long since my last letter. Time moves differently here, like faster somehow. Like there's always something just around the corner that I might miss if I don't pay attention. I've been invited to a documentary screening at the Cinematheque next week. It's the kind of opportunity I dreamed about, but never thought would actually happen. December 8th. Dear Caleb, don't apologize for being busy. I understand completely. I've been caught up in end-of-semester projects myself. There's something beautiful about being so absorbed in work that you lose track of time. I think that's how we know we're doing what we're meant to do. The phone calls had become less frequent too, victim of the time difference and their increasingly complicated schedules. When they did talk, there were awkward pauses that never existed before, moments when Charlotte searched for something to say that would bridge the growing gap between their experiences. You sound different, I told him during our last conversation in November, immediately wishing I could take the words back. Different how? Caleb asked, and I heard a wariness in his voice that hadn't been there before. I don't know. More sophisticated, I guess. Like you're becoming someone new. There was a long pause, filled with the static of the international connection. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? He asked. He said finally, grow and change and become who we're meant to be? Of course, I agreed quickly. I didn't mean it was bad, just different. After that call, Charlotte had sat in her studio for hours, staring at a painting she'd been working on, a self-portrait that had evolved into something more abstract, layers of color that seemed to shift depending on the light. She'd been trying to capture something about identity, about the way people could be multiple versions of themselves simultaneously. But now the painting just looked confused to her, muddy and uncertain. December brought final exams and the holiday break, which Charlotte spent mostly alone in her apartment. Her parents had assumed she'd come home to Millbrook, but she'd made excuses about needing to work on her portfolio. The truth was, she couldn't face the familiar streets and shared memories without Caleb there to give them meaning. Instead, she'd walk the winter streets of Chicago, observing the way the city transformed in the snow. Everything looked cleaner, softer, like the harsh edges had been sanded away. She'd filled a sketchbook with winter scenes, empty playgrounds, snow-covered benches, the frozen lake stretching toward a gray horizon that seemed to go on forever. It was during one of these solitary walks that she'd first seen the flyer for the European Art Workshop, posted on a bulletin board in a coffee shop near the Art Institute. January-March Intensive, Traditional and Contemporary Techniques in Paris, Limited Enrollment, Scholarship Opportunities Available. Charlotte had stared at the flyer for a full minute before pulling out her phone to take a picture of it. Paris, where Caleb was building his new life, discovering his new self. The idea hit her with the force of revelation. What if she could go to him? What if instead of waiting for their relationship to fade into carefully polite letters and stilted phone calls, she could surprise him, show up at his door with all the love and constancy he seemed to be forgetting? The application process consumed her winter break. Portfolio submissions, essays about her artistic goals, phone interviews with the program directors. Charlotte had thrown herself into it with the intensity of someone grasping for a lifeline, working 18-hour days to assemble the strongest possible application. She hadn't told Caleb about her plans. Something held her back, partly the fear that she might not be accepted, but mostly a growing intuition that surprises were more powerful than announcements. If their relationship was becoming routine, predictable, maybe what it needed was the shock of the unexpected. When the acceptance letter arrived in January, along with a partial scholarship that would make the program financially possible, Charlotte had felt a surge of triumph mixed with terror. She was actually going to do this. She was going to Paris. That night, she'd called her best friend, Sarah, who was finishing her senior year at DePaul. "You're insane," Sarah had said, but not unkindly. "Chasing a boy to Europe? That's not like you, Charlotte." "I'm not chasing him," Charlotte had protested. "This is a legitimate art program, an incredible opportunity." "Uh-huh. And the fact that your boyfriend happens to be in Paris is just a coincidence?" Charlotte had been quiet for a moment, watching snow fall past her window in fat, lazy flakes. "Maybe I am chasing him," she'd admitted finally. "Maybe that's exactly what I'm doing. Is that so terrible?" "Not terrible, just what if he doesn't want to be caught?" The question had lodged itself in Charlotte's mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore but too painful to examine directly. What if Sarah was right? What if Caleb's growing distance wasn't just about the challenges of maintaining a long-distance relationship, but about something deeper? A fundamental shift in what he wanted, who he wanted to become. But Charlotte had pushed the doubt away, focusing instead on the practical preparations for her trip. Visa applications, apartment hunting, course registrations. She'd found a tiny studio in the 6th arrondissement, not far from where Caleb was living, through a student housing website. The pictures showed a space barely large enough for a bed and an easel, with a small window that looked out onto a narrow courtyard. It was perfect. She'd planned to tell Caleb about her arrival just a few days before she left, wanting to preserve the element of surprise while giving him enough time to process the news. But as her departure date approached, she'd found herself increasingly reluctant to make that call. What if he didn't seem excited? What if he'd tried to talk her out of coming? What if his reaction confirmed all her growing fears about the state of their relationship? Instead, she'd written him a letter. Old-fashioned, romantic, the kind of gesture that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. February 20th. My dearest Caleb, by the time you read this, I'll be somewhere over the Atlantic, on my way to Paris. I know this might come as a surprise, but I've been accepted to a European art workshop program, and I couldn't pass up the opportunity to see the city that's been shaping you these past months. I'll be staying in the 6th arrondissement for the next 3 months, and I can't wait to explore Paris with you. She'd mailed the letter the day before her flight, calculated to arrive just after she did. By the time Caleb read it, she'd already be in Paris, fait accompli. Now, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, Charlotte pressed her face to the airplane window and watched the sun rise over an endless expanse of clouds. Below them, she knew, was the ocean that had separated her from Caleb for 5 months. In a few hours, that separation would be over. She pulled out her sketchbook and began to draw the view from her window, the way the morning light caught the tops of the clouds, turning them into a landscape of hills and valleys that seemed to go on forever. As she drew, she thought about what Caleb had said that night before he left, about their relationship being like a perfect photograph, captured and unchanging. But photographs, Charlotte knew from her studies in the darkroom, were never really permanent. Light faded them, time yellowed them, and sometimes they revealed things that hadn't been visible when they were first developed. Sometimes you thought you'd captured one thing, only to discover years later that you'd actually documented something entirely different. As the plane began its descent toward Charles de Gaulle Airport, Charlotte closed her sketchbook and tried to quiet the nervous flutter in her stomach. In a few hours, she would see Caleb again. She would learn whether their photograph had survived the journey or whether, like so many images exposed to new light, it had changed into something unrecognizable. The city of Paris spread out below them as they descended, a maze of streets and buildings that looked impossibly elegant even from the air. Charlotte had studied maps and guidebooks, but seeing it in reality was different, more complex, more layered, more beautiful than she had imagined. She was really here. The adventure was about to begin. Part 2. Letters from a Distant Shore. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, slipped under Caleb's apartment door while he was at his early film seminar. He found it when he returned, carrying coffee and a pain au chocolat from the boulangerie on the corner, still half asleep despite the caffeine and the walk through the crisp morning air. The envelope was cream-colored, thick paper that felt substantial between his fingers. His name was written in Charlotte's familiar handwriting, careful letters that slanted slightly to the right, the way she'd been taught in elementary school and never quite unlearned. There was something formal about it, old-fashioned in a way that made him smile, even as a thread of apprehension wound through his chest. Charlotte's letters had been arriving less frequently lately, and his own responses had become more sporadic. It wasn't intentional exactly, more like a natural drift that had started so gradually he'd barely noticed it. Paris had a way of consuming time, of making each day feel dense with possibility and experience. He'd started more letters than he'd finished, sitting at his small desk with his laptop open, trying to capture the texture of his new life in words that would translate across an ocean. How do you explain no way morning light falls differently when it's filtered through centuries of human history? How do you describe the sensation of walking streets that have been walked by so many others that their footsteps seem to echo in the stones themselves? How do you tell someone you love that you're becoming a person you don't entirely recognize, and that sometimes this transformation feels more like awakening than loss? Caleb set down his coffee and tore open the envelope carefully, preserving the wax seal that Charlotte had pressed with a vintage stamp she must have found in one of her thrift store expeditions. The letter was dated February 18th, 2 days ago. My dearest Caleb, By the time you read this, I'll be somewhere over the Atlantic." He read the letter twice before the full meaning registered. Charlotte was coming to Paris. Charlotte was in fact already in Paris, probably asleep in some tiny apartment in the 6th arrondissement, while he stood in his own tiny apartment in the 5th, holding her letter like evidence of a dream he wasn't sure he wanted to wake from. His first reaction was pure joy, the kind of uncomplicated happiness he hadn't felt in months. Charlotte was here. The person who knew him best in the world, who understood the way his mind worked and the dreams he carried, was a metro ride away. They could walk along the Seine together, explore the Louvre, sit in cafes and talk about art and films and all the ideas that had been building up in his head, with no one to share them with who would truly understand. But the joy was quickly complicated by something else: anxiety, guilt, a sense of worlds colliding in ways he wasn't prepared for. Because the truth was, Caleb had been different here. Not just sophisticated or worldly as Charlotte had observed during your last phone call, but fundamentally different. He'd discovered parts of himself that were dormant in Illinois, aspects of his personality that only emerged when he was speaking French, moving through a culture that was both familiar and foreign. And there was Isabel. Caleb sank into his only chair, still holding Charlotte's letter, and tried to trace how it had happened. When at his evening study sessions with his classmates turned into long dinners at bistros in Saint-Germain? When had those dinners evolved into gallery openings and film screenings and parties in apartments that seemed impossibly sophisticated to his American eyes? When had his friendship with Isabel Moreau crossed the line into something entirely different? Isabel was everything that Paris represented to him: elegant, intellectually curious, comfortable in multiple languages and cultures. She was the daughter of a film producer and an art dealer, raised in an apartment near the Luxembourg Gardens that was filled with original paintings and first edition books. She spoke about Godard and Truffaut not as subjects of academic study, but as family friends, directors who had eaten at her parents' dinner table and argued about cinema while she did her homework in the next room. Their first real conversation had happened at a screening of Breathless at a small theater in the Latin Quarter. Caleb had been there alone, as had become his habit on Friday nights, letting himself be absorbed into the city's rich film culture. Isabel had been sitting 2 seats away, and during the discussion afterward, she'd made an observation about the film's improvised dialogue that had shifted his entire understanding of the movie. "You have to remember," she said in her accented English, "that Godard was responding to the artificiality of traditional French cinema. But he wasn't rejecting structure entirely. He was finding a new kind of structure, one that could accommodate spontaneity without losing dramatic coherence." They continued the conversation over wine at a cafe nearby, talking until the servers were stacking chairs around them and the morning street cleaners were beginning their rounds. Isabel had a way of thinking that was both rigorous and intuitive, grounded in deep knowledge but open to new possibilities. Talking with her felt like jazz, improvisational but sophisticated, full of unexpected turns that somehow always resolved into harmony. She'd invited me to a gallery opening the following week, and then to dinner with her friends, and gradually Caleb had found himself drawn into a social circle that represented everything he'd imagined about European intellectual life. These were people who thought nothing of spending an evening debating the politics of representation in contemporary art, who moved seamlessly between French and English and sometimes Italian, who had opinions about wine and strong feelings about architecture. With them, Caleb discovered that he could be charming in ways he'd never been in Illinois. His American perspective, his earnestness about film and media, even his occasional cultural missteps became assets rather than limitations. He was exotic in a way that was flattering rather than othering, different enough to be interesting but similar enough to belong. The first time they'd kissed, it had happened almost without his conscious decision. They'd been walking along the Seine after a late dinner, the lights of the city reflecting in the dark water, and she'd stopped to point out something about the architecture of the bridges. When he'd turned to respond, she'd been closer than he'd expected, her face tilted up toward his, and the kiss had felt as inevitable as gravity. Afterward, walking her back to her apartment in the 7th arrondissement, Caleb had felt like he was moving through a dream. This was his life now. Late-night conversations with beautiful, intelligent women, walks along the most romantic river in the world, kisses that tasted like wine and possibility. He'd thought about Charlotte that night, of course. Thought about calling her, confessing what had happened, trying to explain the complicated feelings that were reshaping his understanding of himself and what he wanted. But what could he have said? That he was falling in love with another woman? That the life he'd built with Charlotte suddenly felt small and provincial compared to the vastness of what Paris was offering him? Instead, he'd written her a careful letter about his classes and his work, edited of any mention of Isabel or the social world he was discovering. He'd told himself he was protecting her feelings, that there was no need to cause pain over something that might be temporary, a product of novelty and distance that would resolve itself when he returned to Illinois. But as the weeks passed and his involvement with Isabel deepened, Caleb had been forced to confront the possibility that this wasn't temporary at all. He'd started having conversations with his program advisors about extending his stay, maybe applying for graduate programs in Paris, maybe building a life that could accommodate both his American identity and this new European self he was discovering. And now Charlotte was here, carrying with her all the history and expectation and genuine love that he'd been trying so hard not to think about. She was here with her artist's eyes and her generous heart and her complete faith in the relationship they'd built together. She was here, and he was going to have to tell her about Isabel. Caleb looked at his watch. 10:30 a.m. If Charlotte had arrived yesterday as planned, she was probably awake by now, maybe exploring her new neighborhood, maybe looking for a cafe where she could get coffee and figure out how to reach him. He should call her, or better yet, go to her apartment. He should be the boyfriend she deserved, excited and welcoming and ready to share his city with her. Instead, he found himself reaching for his phone to text Isabel. "Charlotte is here, my girlfriend from America. I need to talk to you." The response came back quickly, as Isabel's messages always did. She was one of those people who treated communication like a conversation, immediate and engaged, rather than the careful compositions that characterized Caleb's exchanges with Charlotte. "Ah, I wondered when this would happen. Come to the cafe near my apartment. We'll figure this out together." Caleb dressed quickly, choosing his clothes with the kind of care that had become second nature in Paris. Appearance mattered here in ways it hadn't in Illinois, not out of vanity, but out of respect for the aesthetic standards of a culture that treated style as a form of courtesy. He pulled on dark jeans and a wool sweater, the kind of understated elegance that Isabel had helped him develop. As he walked toward the 7th arrondissement, crossing the Seine on the Pont du Carrousel, Caleb tried to prepare himself for the conversation he was about to have. How do you tell someone that you've fallen in love with them while you're still, technically, in love with someone else? How do you explain that feelings can be layered and complicated, that the heart isn't always the monogamous organ that popular culture pretends it is? Isabel was waiting for him at their usual table, already nursing a café au lait and reading Liberation. She looked up as he approached, her dark eyes taking in his expression with the kind of perceptive intelligence that had drawn him to her in the first place. "You look terrible," she said in French, then switched to English. "Sit down. Tell me about this American girlfriend." Caleb ordered coffee he didn't want and tried to find words for the situation he'd created. "Her name is Charlotte. We've been together since high school. She's an art student, a painter. She's wonderful." "I'm sure she is." Isabel's tone was neutral, neither dismissive nor judgmental. "And you love her?" "I do. I did. Caleb stopped, frustrated by the inadequacy of English tenses to capture the temporality of emotion. "It's complicated." "It always is." Isabel folded her newspaper and leaned back in her chair, studying him. "What are you going to do?" I don't know. She's here for 3 months. She's expecting us to pick up where we left off, to explore the city together, to be the couple we were before I came here. But you're not the same person who left Illinois. No, I'm not. Isabel was quiet for a moment, watching pedestrians move past the cafe windows. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle but clear. Caleb, I need to know something. What we have, is it real for you? Or am I just part of your European adventure, something exotic that will lose its appeal when you go back to your real life? The question hit me with unexpected force. He'd been so focused on the problem of Charlotte's arrival that he hadn't fully examined his feelings for Isabel, hadn't asked himself what he truly wanted beyond the immediate pleasure of her company. It's real, he said, and knew as he spoke that it was true. What we have, it's the realest thing I felt in months, maybe ever. Isabel nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then you have to tell her, you're Charlotte. You owe her that honesty. I know. It's just, she's come so far. She's given up so much to be here. And I know her. She's going to blame herself, think she did something wrong or wasn't enough somehow. Perhaps, but keeping the truth from her won't protect her from pain. It will only make it worse when she finally learns it. And she will learn it, Caleb. These things have a way of revealing themselves. Caleb knew she was right, but the knowledge didn't make the prospect any less daunting. He'd tried to imagine Charlotte's face when he told her about Isabel, the way her careful composure would crack and reveal the hurt underneath. Charlotte had always been transparent in her emotions, unable to hide what she was feeling, even when she wanted to. It was one of the things he loved about her in Illinois, but now it seemed like a vulnerability that would only make this conversation more painful. Maybe I should wait. Give her a few days to settle in, to see the city. Let her have that, at least, before I... Isabel reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Caleb, the kindest thing you can do is tell her quickly. Every day you wait is another day she's building expectations that won't be met. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the morning life of Paris unfold around them. A woman in a perfectly tailored coat walked past with a small dog, both of them moving with the unhurried elegance that seemed to be the city's default setting. Students from the nearby university hurried past with their arms full of books, speaking rapidly in French about assignments and examinations. This was the world Caleb had learned to inhabit, where he discovered new facets of himself that he'd never known existed. How could he explain to Charlotte that the person she'd come to find had evolved into someone she might not recognize? I should go, he said finally. I should find her, talk to her before... Before what? Before I lose my nerve. Isabel smiled sadly. You won't lose your nerve. You're braver than you think. Caleb Morrison from Illinois. It's one of the things I noticed about you first. As he walked back across the river toward the 6th arrondissement, Caleb felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. The address Charlotte had given him was on Rue de Tournande, a narrow street lined with tall buildings that leaned toward each other as if sharing secrets. He found the number easily, a dark wooden door set between a bookshop and a wine bar, the kind of building that had probably housed students and artists for generations. He stood outside for several minutes, trying to summon the courage to ring the bell. Around him, the life of the neighborhood continued its familiar rhythm. An elderly man emerged from the bookshop with a package wrapped in brown paper. A woman in paint-stained jeans unlocked a bicycle from the lamppost in front of the wine bar. These small, ordinary moments suddenly felt precious to Caleb, like the last minutes of an old life before everything changed. Finally, he pressed the buzzer for apartment 3B. Oui? The voice through the intercom was tentative, heavily accented with the effort of speaking French. Charlotte? It's me. There was a pause, and then the sound of footsteps running downstairs, taking them two at a time in a way that was so characteristically Charlotte that Caleb felt his chest tighten with a mixture of affection and dread. The door opened, and there she was. She looked exactly the same and completely different, which Caleb realized was probably how he looked to her as well. Same auburn hair, same green eyes that seemed to notice everything, same freckles scattered across her nose like paint drops. But there was something new in her expression, a confidence he didn't remember, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there when he'd left Illinois. Caleb. She said his name like she was testing its weight, making sure it still fit in her mouth. "You're here." "So are you." I managed to smile. "I got your letter this morning." I thought maybe I'd have a day or two to settle in before you found me, but I'm glad you're here." She stepped back, gesturing him into the narrow hallway. "Do you want to come up? See my Parisian palace?" The apartment was exactly what he'd expected based on Charlotte's description. Tiny, charming, with a single window that let in filtered light from the courtyard. Her suitcases were still packed, but she'd already set up her easel near the window and arranged her art supplies on the small table with the methodical care he remembered from her studio back in home. "It's perfect," he said, and meant it. The space felt quintessentially Charlotte. Organized but lived in, practical but touched with beauty and small details. "Isn't it?" "I know it's small, but there's something about small spaces that makes you focus on what's really important." She moved around the apartment as she spoke, her hands gesturing in the animated way that meant she was excited, nervous, or both. "I've already found a cafe down the street where they make the most incredible croissants, and there's this bookshop next door that has an entire section of art books in English, and the woman who runs it speaks 4 languages and knows everything about the neighborhood." Caleb watched her talk, noting the way she was trying to fill the space between them with words as if silence might allow room for complications they weren't ready to address. He knew he should interrupt her, should tell her about Isabel while they were still in the warm glow of reunion, before expectation had time to solidify into assumption. But instead, he found himself asking, "Are you hungry? There's a place I know nearby, a little bistro where they make the best onion soup in the city." Charlotte's face lit up. "I'm starving. Actually, I was too nervous to eat much on the plane, and I haven't figured out the French grocery stores yet." As they walked through the winding streets toward the restaurant, Charlotte peppered him with questions about his life in Paris, and Caleb found himself giving her the sanitized version he'd perfected in his letters. He told her about his classes, his professors, the films he'd been watching. He pointed out architectural details and historical sites, playing the role of knowledgeable guide while carefully editing out any mention of the social life that had become so central to his experience. The bistro was warm and crowded, filled with the kind of animated conversation that Caleb had learned to associate with Parisian lunch culture. They found a small table near the window, and Charlotte immediately began sketching the scene around them. Quick, observational drawings that captured not just what people looked like, but how they moved, how they gestured, the relationships implied by their positioning. "You've gotten better," Caleb observed, watching her pencil move across the paper with confident strokes.
"Different, maybe. I've been working with some new techniques, experimenting with ways to capture movement and time in static images." She looked up from her sketchbook. "Actually, that makes me think of something you said once, about filming time itself. Have you been working on anything like that here?" The question opened a door that Caleb had been trying to keep closed. His current project, a short documentary about the intersection of traditional and contemporary culture in Paris, had been inspired partly by conversations with Isabel, who had introduced him to subjects and perspectives he never would have discovered on his own. "I'm working on something," he said carefully, "a documentary about how young Parisians navigate between preserving tradition and embracing change. It's more complex than I initially thought." "That sounds fascinating, and very you, finding the human story in larger cultural questions." Charlotte's smile was genuinely proud, and Caleb felt the guilt twist deeper into his chest. They talked through lunch, and for stretches of time, Caleb could almost pretend that nothing had changed. Charlotte's way of seeing the world was as unique and insightful as ever, her observations about art and culture sharp and original. She told me about her work at the Art Institute, about professors who had challenged her assumptions and techniques that had opened new possibilities in her painting. But underneath the easy conversation, Caleb was aware of a fundamental disconnect. Charlotte was talking to the person she remembered, relating to a version of him that no longer entirely existed, and he was responding as that person, falling back into familiar patterns of interaction, while the parts of himself he discovered in Paris remained hidden, unacknowledged. After lunch, they walked toward the Seine, and Charlotte pulled out her sketchbook again, this time to draw the view from the Pont Neuf. "I've been thinking about light a lot lately," she said as she worked. "The way it's different in different places. The quality of light here is incredible, softer somehow, more layered, like it's been filtered through centuries of history." "That's exactly what I thought when I first got here," then immediately regretted the admission. It highlighted how long he'd been here, how much he'd experienced without her. Charlotte looked up from her drawing. "What else did you think? When you first arrived, I mean. What was it like?" The question opened a door that Caleb had been trying to keep closed. How could he describe his first impressions of Paris without mentioning the loneliness that had driven him to seek out new social connections? How could he talk about his early experiences without acknowledging how they had, inevitably, led to Isabel? It was overwhelming, which was true as far as it went. Everything was familiar from films and books, but also completely new, like visiting a place you've dreamed about and finding out it's both exactly what you expected and nothing like what you imagined. They continued walking, crossing into the Latin Quarter where Caleb had spent so many evenings with Isabel and their friends. Every corner held memories that he couldn't share, experiences that belonged to a version of his life that Charlotte wasn't part of. "I want to see your apartment," Charlotte said as they paused in front of a bookshop, "and meet your friends. I want to understand what your life has been like here." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. Of course she wanted to meet his friends. Of course she wanted to see how he'd been living, to be integrated into the world he had built for himself. It was a natural expectation, the kind of thing any caring partner would want. "Most of my friends are, well, they're very French, very intellectual. Their English isn't always perfect, and they can be a bit intimidating to outsiders." Charlotte laughed. "Caleb, I'm an art student in Chicago. I think I can handle intimidating intellectuals." As they walked back toward his neighborhood, Caleb's phone buzzed with a text from Isabel. "How did it go? Are you okay?" He slipped the phone back into his pocket without responding, but Charlotte had noticed the interruption. "Everything all right?" "Just a friend asking about an assignment." The lie came so easily that it frightened him. When had he become someone who could lie so smoothly to someone he loved? His apartment felt different with Charlotte in it, smaller and somehow less sophisticated than it had seemed that morning. She examined everything with the careful attention she remembered, the books on his desk, the photographs he had pinned to the wall, the small details that revealed how he'd been living. "So, it's very you," she said finally, settling into his single chair, organized but comfortable, like a monk's cell, but a monk who really liked cinema. Caleb made coffee while Charlotte continued to explore, pulling books from his shelves and commenting on the films he had collected. It felt domestic and comfortable and completely wrong, like they were playing house while ignoring the fundamental instability of their foundation. "So," Charlotte said, accepting a cup of coffee, "tell me about this documentary you're working on. I want to hear everything." And there it was, the opening he'd been both dreading and waiting for. He could tell her about the project, about the people he'd interviewed, about the insights he'd gained. He could tell her about Isabel, about the way meeting her had changed his understanding of what it meant to be both traditional and modern, both rooted and cosmopolitan. he could tell her the truth. Instead, he found himself describing the project in the most general terms, focusing on the technical aspects and the theoretical framework, while carefully avoiding any mention of the personal relationships that had shaped his understanding. Charlotte listened with the focused attention she brought to everything that mattered to her, asking thoughtful questions and making connections that revealed how well she understood his interests and methods. Her engagement was genuine and insightful, which only made Caleb's omissions feel more significant. As the afternoon wore on, they fell into a rhythm that felt like an echo of their old relationship. Charlotte worked on a new sketch while Caleb reviewed footage on his laptop, both of them comfortable in shared silence, punctuated by occasional observations or questions. It was peaceful and familiar, and Caleb found himself wondering if maybe he'd been overthinking the situation. Maybe he could maintain both relationships, keep the different parts of his life in separate compartments that didn't have to intersect. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was both impossible and unfair. Charlotte deserved honesty, and so did Isabel. And he deserved the chance to make a real choice, rather than drifting between options until circumstances made the choice for him. His phone buzzed again, and this time, when he checked it, Charlotte was watching. "Popular today," she observed mildly. "It's just friends wanting to make plans." "Well, don't let me stop you from maintaining your social life. Actually, I'd love to meet some of these friends. Maybe we could all have dinner together this week." The suggestion was so reasonable, so perfectly normal, that Caleb felt trapped by its very sensibleness. Of course Charlotte wanted to meet his friends. Of course she wanted to be part of his life here. That was why she'd come to Paris in the first place. Let me see what people are doing this week. Everyone's pretty busy with midterm projects right now." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his small apartment, Charlotte started packing up her art supplies. "I should get back. I'm still adjusting to the time difference, and I want to explore my neighborhood a bit before it gets dark." Caleb walked her back to Rue de Tournon, and they stood outside her building as the evening settled around them. Charlotte looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Expectant, but also slightly uncertain, as if she was waiting for some confirmation that things between them were as she'd hoped they would be. "I'm so glad I'm here. I've missed this. Missed us." She rose up on her toes to kiss him, and Caleb felt the familiar warmth of her lips, the scent of her hair, the way she fit perfectly against him. For a moment, he was transported back to Illinois, to the simplicity of loving someone without complication or conflict. But when they separated, he was still standing on a street in Paris, still carrying the weight of secrets that grew heavier with every hour he delayed telling them. "I've missed you too," which was true in ways that made everything else more complicated. As he walked back toward his apartment, Caleb's phone rang. Isabel's name appeared on the screen. "Bonsoir. How are you holding up?" "I don't know," he admitted. She's exactly who I remembered, and that makes this so much harder." "Did you tell her?" The question hung in the evening air, and Caleb realized that his silence was answer enough. "Caleb, I know I have to tell her. I need one more day to figure out how to do it in a way that doesn't destroy her." There was a pause, and when Isabel spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. "There is no way to do it that doesn't hurt her, but every day you wait makes it worse, for her and for you, and for me too, if I'm being honest." After they hung up,
Caleb stood in his apartment feeling like he was balanced on the edge of a precipice. On one side was the safe, familiar territory of his relationship with Charlotte, 4 years of shared history and genuine love. On the other was the uncertain but exhilarating landscape he'd discovered with Isabel, full of possibilities he was still learning to name. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would tell Charlotte everything. He would accept whatever consequences followed and try to find a way forward that honored both the love he'd had and the love he'd found. But tonight, he would let himself exist in the space between decisions, in the last hours before everything changed irrevocably. Outside his window, Paris settled into its evening rhythm, and Caleb watched the lights come on across the city like stars being born in the gathering dusk.
Part 3. The Unexpected Surprise. Charlotte woke to the sound of rain against her small window, a gentle percussion that seemed to welcome her officially to Paris. She'd been dreaming about Illinois, walking through the fields behind her childhood home while snow fell in thick, silent flakes. In the dream, she'd been searching for something she'd lost, following footprints that disappeared just as she thought she was catching up to their owner. She stretched in the narrow bed, feeling the pleasant ache of travel in her muscles, and allowed herself to fully absorb the reality of where she was. Paris. The word itself felt like a small miracle in her mouth, weighted with history and possibility. The afternoon with Caleb had been good, different than she'd expected in ways she couldn't quite articulate, but good. He seemed more confident here, more at ease with himself. There had been moments during their conversation when she'd glimpsed someone she didn't entirely recognize, someone more urbane, more sophisticated than the earnest boy she'd fallen in love with in Illinois. But underneath the new polish, she could still see the Caleb she knew, still hear the passion in his voice when he talked about his work. Charlotte made coffee with the small electric kettle she'd found in the apartment and stood by the window, watching the rain create patterns on the glass. The courtyard below was coming alive with morning activity. A woman in a red coat hurrying across the cobblestones with a baguette under her arm, an elderly man tending to the small garden that occupied one corner of the space. She pulled out her sketchbook and began drawing the scene, trying to capture not just what she saw, but what she felt. The sense of being an observer in a world that was carrying on its ancient routines, regardless of her presence. There was something both humbling and liberating about anonymity, about being unknown in a place that had existed for centuries before her birth, and would continue long after she was gone. Her phone rang, interrupting her reverie. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "How's Paris treating you, world traveler?" Charlotte settled back onto her bed, tucking her legs under her. "It's incredible, overwhelming and beautiful, and somehow exactly what I expected, and nothing like I expected, all at the same time." "And how's the reunion with Prince Charming?" "Good," Charlotte said, then paused. "He seems different here. More mature, I think. Like he's grown into himself in a way he hadn't back at home." "Different how?" Charlotte considered the question. There had been something in Caleb's manner yesterday, a certain carefulness in how he chose his words, how he presented his life to me. It wasn't dishonesty, exactly, more like curation. I don't know, more worldly, maybe? He knows the city really well, has all these opinions about restaurants and neighborhoods, and when he talks about his work, there's this confidence that wasn't there before. That sounds like a good thing. It is. It's definitely a good thing. Charlotte paused, picking at the blanket. "I guess I'm just anxious about everything being perfect. I've built this whole fantasy about what these 3 months would be like, and now I'm worried that reality won't live up to it."
When has reality ever lived up to fantasy? That's not the point. The point is to let yourself experience whatever this actually is, rather than whatever you thought it would be. After they hung up, Charlotte dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt appropriately Parisian. Dark jeans, a soft gray sweater, boots that could handle wet cobblestones. She'd planned to spend the morning exploring her neighborhood, mapping out the cafes and shops and parks that would become part of her daily life. But first, she wanted to surprise Caleb. The idea had come to her while she was talking to Sarah. What if his distraction yesterday had simply been the shock of seeing her? What if what he needed was time to process her arrival, to shift from the mindset of solitary student to boyfriend with visiting girlfriend? Maybe the best thing she could do was show up at his apartment with coffee and pastries, demonstrate that she understood his life here and wanted to be part of it rather than disrupting it. She stopped at the boulangerie she discovered the day before, where the woman behind the counter greeted her with patient kindness as Charlotte struggled through her order in elementary French. 2 coffees, 2 pain au chocolat, the kind of simple breakfast that felt perfectly suited to a rainy Paris morning. The walk to Caleb's neighborhood gave her a chance to see the city in a different light, literally and figuratively. Yesterday's golden afternoon sunshine made everything look postcard perfect, but this morning's gray sky revealed a more complex beauty. The way the wet stones of the buildings seemed to glow with their own inner light, the way the bare branches of the trees created intricate patterns against the pearl-colored sky. Charlotte found herself stopping frequently to sketch quick impressions in her book. The reflection of a cafe's neon sign in a puddle, the way an elderly woman's bright scarf provided the only spot of color on an entire street, the geometric shapes created by fire escapes and balconies disappearing into the mist. By the time she reached Caleb's building, she was thoroughly soaked, but filled with the kind of creative energy that always came to her in new places. She climbed the narrow stairs to his floor, balancing the coffee and pastries while trying to quiet her excitement. She was about to knock when she heard voices from inside, Caleb's voice, familiar and warm, and a woman's voice speaking in French. She paused, her hand frozen halfway to the door. Of course Caleb had friends here, female friends. She'd been hoping to meet them after all. But something in the timbre of the conversation made her hesitate. This wasn't the casual banter of classmates, or the formal politeness of acquaintances. There was an intimacy to it, an ease and affection that made Charlotte's stomach clench with sudden anxiety. She couldn't understand the words. Her high school French was no match for native speed and fluency, but she could read the emotional undertone. This was the way 2 people talked when they knew each other well, when they shared private jokes and personal history. Charlotte stood in the hallway, rain dripping from her coat onto the worn carpet, and felt the bottom drop out of her world. The conversation continued, punctuated by laughter that sounded genuine and comfortable. Charlotte caught Caleb's name, and what might have been plans being made, schedules being coordinated. At one point, the woman's voice dropped to what sounded like a murmur of endearment, and Caleb responded with something that made her laugh again. Charlotte's hands were shaking now, the coffee growing cold in its paper cups. She should knock, she knew. She should announce herself, meet this friend of Caleb's, dispel whatever fears were building in her imagination. There were perfectly innocent explanations for what she was hearing. Language exchange partners, study groups, the kind of close friendships that developed naturally among students abroad. But her intuition, the part of her that noticed shadows and light and the spaces between things, was telling her a different story. She'd heard something in Caleb's voice that she'd never heard before, a warmth and playfulness that seemed to belong to this place, to this life he'd built without her.
Charlotte pulled out her phone and stared at Caleb's number. She could call him, ask about the woman she'd heard, give him the chance to explain. But something held her back. fear, maybe, or a growing certainty that she wasn't ready for whatever truth he might tell her. Instead, she found herself dialing another number. Mom? Charlotte, honey, how are you? How's Paris? Her mother's voice, warm and familiar across the ocean, made Charlotte's eyes fill with tears she hadn't realized were building. It's beautiful, Mom. Really incredible. You don't sound happy. What's wrong? Charlotte had inherited her transparency from her mother's side of the family, the inability to hide emotional turbulence even when she wanted to. I think maybe Caleb has a girlfriend here. The words hung in the air, and Charlotte realized it was the first time she'd allowed herself to name the fear that had been growing in her chest. Oh, sweetheart, what happened? Charlotte told her about the voices in the apartment, about the intimacy she'd sensed in the conversation, about the way Caleb had seemed different yesterday, present but somehow holding part of himself back. It could be nothing, her mother said gently. It could be exactly what you said, a friend, a study partner. You won't know until you ask him directly. But what if it's not nothing? What if I've flown halfway around the world to find out that the person I love is falling in love with someone else? There was a pause, and Charlotte could picture her mother sitting in the kitchen of their house in Illinois, looking out at the fields that had once seemed like the entire world. Then you'll deal with it, her mother said finally. You'll be hurt and angry and probably confused, but you'll deal with it because that's who you are. And maybe you'll discover that you're stronger than you think you are. After they hung up, Charlotte sat in the rain and tried to imagine what strength would look like in this situation. She'd come to Paris with such clear intentions, to surprise the man she loved, to share in his European adventure, to deepen their relationship by experiencing this incredible city together. The possibility that those plans might be naive, based on assumptions that were no longer valid, hadn't really occurred to her. But sitting there in the gray morning light, watching Parisians hurry past with their umbrellas and purposeful strides, Charlotte began to consider a different possibility. What if this trip wasn't about Caleb at all? What if it was about her, about the artist and the woman she was becoming, about discoveries that had nothing to do with romantic love? She thought about the application essay she'd written for the art program, about the goals she'd articulated for studying in Europe. None of those goals had been dependent on Caleb's presence or approval. She'd wanted to experience how different light and architecture and cultural perspectives might influence her work. She'd wanted to challenge herself artistically and personally, to step outside her comfort zone and see what she was capable of when she couldn't rely on familiar environments and relationships. Maybe those goals were still valid regardless of what was happening between her and Caleb. Charlotte stood up from the bench, water dripping from her coat, and made a decision. She would go back to her apartment, shower and change into dry clothes, and then she would explore Paris as herself, not as Caleb's girlfriend, not as half of a couple, but as Charlotte Morrison, artist and adventurer who had earned the right to be in this incredible city through her own work and determination. She would give Caleb the space to tell her whatever he needed to tell her, in his own time and in his own way. But she wouldn't wait passively for that conversation. She would build her own relationship with Paris, create her own network of experiences and connections and discoveries. And if it turned out that her fears were justified, if Caleb had indeed found someone else, then she would deal with that reality from a position of strength rather than dependence. The rain was beginning to lighten as Charlotte walked back to her apartment, and she found herself noticing details she'd missed on the way out. The way the wet pavement reflected the warm light from cafe windows, the architectural flourishes on buildings that revealed themselves only to careful observers, the small acts of kindness between strangers navigating the weather together.
She stopped at a different cafe, one that looked like it catered to locals rather than tourists, and ordered coffee in her halting French. The barista, a young woman about her own age with short dark hair and paint stains on her apron, responded with encouraging patience. "You are American?" "Yes, I'm here for an art program." "Ah, an artist. Me too. I am Margot." She gestured to the paintings on the cafe walls, moody cityscapes that captured the essence of Paris in rain and shadow. "Charlotte, these are beautiful. Did you do them?" "Some, yes. I paint mostly at night when the light is different, more mysterious, you know?" They chatted for a few minutes about art and the challenges of creating in a new city, and Charlotte felt something ease in her chest. Here was a connection that had nothing to do with Caleb, a potential friendship based on shared interests and artistic passion. "Maybe sometime you would like to paint together," Margot suggested as Charlotte prepared to leave. "I know good places with interesting light." "I'd love that," Charlotte said, and meant it. Walking back to her apartment, Charlotte felt something shifting in her perspective. The morning's discovery or suspected discovery about Caleb still hurt, still created a knot of anxiety in her chest, but it no longer felt like the end of the world. She was in Paris. She was an artist with 3 months to explore one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Whatever happened with Caleb, whatever truths emerged from the complicated web of their long-distance relationship, she was here for reasons that transcended any single person or relationship. Back in her apartment, Charlotte changed into dry clothes and set up her easel by the window. She began a new painting, not of the courtyard scene she'd sketched earlier, but something more abstract. Layers of gray and blue that suggested rain and movement, with subtle touches of gold that might have been lamplight or might have been hope. As she worked, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of brush on canvas, Charlotte realized that this was what she'd really come to Paris to find. Not romantic resolution, but artistic evolution. The woman who had left Chicago 3 days ago had been defined largely in relation to other people, daughter, girlfriend, student, but the woman who was emerging in this small apartment in this foreign city felt more complete, more autonomous. Her phone buzzed with a text from Caleb. "Want to have dinner tonight? I'll cook." Charlotte stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Actually, I think I need a quiet evening to settle in. Maybe tomorrow." It was the first time in their relationship that she'd chosen her own needs over his invitation, and the small act of self-assertion felt significant. Outside her window, the rain stopped and a watery sun appeared between the clouds, casting everything in soft, golden light. Charlotte mixed a new color on her palette, a warm ochre that reminded her of autumn afternoons in Illinois, but softer somehow, more complex. She was beginning to understand that this trip would change her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The question was whether she was brave enough to embrace that change, wherever it might lead.
Part 4. The Truth Unveiled. The invitation came on Thursday, slipped under Charlotte's door like a secret, written in careful cursive on cream-colored paper that felt expensive between her fingers. "You are cordially invited to a salon evening at the home of Isabelle Moreau. Friday, 8 p.m., 15 Rue de Grenelle, 7th Arrondissement. An evening of art, film, and conversation among friends." Charlotte stared at the invitation, turning it over in her hands. She'd never heard Caleb mention anyone named Isabelle, but the formality of the invitation suggested someone well-connected, someone who moved in the kind of sophisticated Parisian circles that Charlotte had only imagined from movies and novels. At the bottom, in different handwriting, masculine, familiar, someone had added, "Charlotte, please come. I think you'd really enjoy meeting everyone. C." Caleb's addition felt like an afterthought, hastily scrawled after the formal invitation had been written. Charlotte wondered if he'd asked to have her included,
or if this Isabel had suggested it herself. The uncertainty made her stomach clench with anxiety. She'd been in Paris for 5 days now, and her relationship with Caleb had settled into a strange pattern of polite distance. They'd had coffee twice, walked through the Louvre for an afternoon, shared a dinner at a bistro where they'd discussed art and film with the careful neutrality of friendly acquaintances. He was attentive, but somehow absent, present but holding something back. Charlotte had begun to recognize the signs, the way he checked his phone more frequently during our conversations, the slight hesitation before he answered questions about his friends or his social life, the way he always suggested activities that kept them moving, rather than settling into the kind of intimate conversation that might lead to difficult topics. She'd started to build her own life in response, spending long hours in museums and galleries, finding cafes where she could sketch and paint, slowly expanding her circle of acquaintances. Margot from the cafe had introduced her to other young artists, and Charlotte had begun to feel the stirrings of a social life that existed independently of Caleb. But this invitation felt like a test, an opportunity to see the world Caleb had been so careful to keep separate from her. She spent Friday afternoon choosing what to wear, finally settling on a black dress that was elegant without being too formal, paired with boots that would handle cobblestone streets. She applied makeup with more care than usual, as if armor were required for whatever she might discover. The address led her to a building in one of Paris's most exclusive neighborhoods, its limestone facade glowing golden in the early evening light. The heavy wooden door opened to reveal a courtyard that looked like something from a period film, complete with wrought iron balconies and flowering vines that climbed toward tall windows. Charlotte climbed to the 3rd floor, following the sound of conversation and soft jazz music. The door to apartment 3A stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the hallway along with the murmur of voices speaking in French and English. She knocked softly and was greeted by a woman who could only be Isabelle Moreau. She was beautiful, in the effortless way that Charlotte had always associated with French women. Dark hair pulled back in a style that looked casual, but probably required significant skill. Intelligent brown eyes, clothes that were expensive without being showy. But it was more than physical beauty. There was an aura of confidence and sophistication that seemed to emanate from her like perfume. You are cordially invited to a salon evening at the home of Isabelle Moreau. She was beautiful in the effortless way that Charlotte had always associated with French women. Dark hair pulled back in a style that looked casual, but probably required significant skill. Intelligent brown eyes, clothes that were expensive without being showy. But it was more than physical beauty. There was an aura of confidence and sophistication that seemed to emanate from her like perfume. "You must be Charlotte," Isabelle said in accented English, extending her hand with genuine warmth. "I am so pleased you could come. Caleb has told me so much about you." The words were perfectly polite, but Charlotte caught something in Isabelle's expression, a flicker of assessment, perhaps, or curiosity. This woman knew something about Charlotte's situation that Charlotte herself was still trying to understand. "Thank you for including me," Charlotte managed. "Your home is beautiful." And it was. The apartment was everything Charlotte had imagined a Parisian salon should be. High ceilings with ornate molding, walls lined with books and original artwork, furniture that looked like it had been collected over generations rather than purchased from any single store. Candles flickered on every surface, creating pools of warm light that made everyone look like they were posing for a painting. About 20 people were scattered throughout the living room, engaged in animated conversations in multiple languages. I recognized the type from my art school in Chicago. Intellectuals and creatives who took their ideas seriously, who could debate the merits of different film techniques or artistic movements with passion and precision. I spotted Caleb near the windows, deep in conversation with two men who looked like graduate students. He was gesturing as he spoke, his face animated in a way I recognized. This is how he looked when he was discussing something he cared about deeply. But when he noticed Charlotte's arrival, something shifted in his expression. The animation faded, replaced by something more guarded. He excused himself from his conversation and crossed the room to her. "Charlotte, you came." He kissed her cheek, but the gesture felt perfunctory, performed for the benefit of their audience, rather than expressing genuine affection. "Let me introduce you to everyone." The next hour passed in a blur of names and handshakes, conversations about contemporary art and European cinema that Charlotte tried to follow, despite her limited knowledge of the references. Everyone was polite, even welcoming, but she felt like an outsider, observing a world she didn't fully understand. And through it all, she found herself watching Isabel. The way Isabel moved to her own party was mesmerizing. She seemed to know everyone, to be genuinely interested in what each person had to say, and to effortlessly facilitate conversations that brought out the best in her guests. She was clearly intelligent, well-read, sophisticated in a way that came from education and privilege, rather than affectation. She was also, Charlotte realized with growing certainty, in love with Caleb. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that could be pointed to as evidence, but Charlotte had spent 4 years learning to read the subtle signs of emotion, to notice the spaces between words and gestures. She saw how Isabel's attention tracked Caleb's movement around the room, how her smile became more genuine when she was talking to him, how she created opportunities for them to stand closer together during group conversations. And Caleb, Charlotte watched him too, noting the way he seemed more himself when he was near Isabel, more relaxed and confident. Their interactions had the easy intimacy of people who had spent significant time together, who understood each other's references and responded to each other's moods. During a lull in conversation, Charlotte excused herself and found the bathroom, needing a moment alone to process what she was observing. The bathroom was as elegant as the rest of the apartment, with a vintage mirror that reflected her pale face back at her with unforgiving clarity. She looked tired, she realized, tired and out of place, like someone trying to play a role she wasn't suited for. Around her, she could hear the party continuing, laughter and conversation and the clink of glasses, the sound of people genuinely enjoying each other's company. When she returned to the living room, she found Caleb and Isabel standing together by the bookshelf, their heads close together as Isabel showed him something in a book. The intimacy of the moment was unmistakable. The way they stood within each other's personal space, the way Caleb's hand rested briefly on Isabel's shoulder, the way they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching.
Charlotte felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest, a certainty that cut through all her previous speculation and doubt. She waited until the moment felt natural, then approached them. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Caleb, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Something flickered in his eyes, relief perhaps, or resignation. "Of course. Isabel, excuse us?" "Naturellement," Isabel said, her smile polite, but not quite reaching her eyes. They found a quiet corner near the kitchen, where the sounds of the party provided cover for private conversation. "Charlotte," Caleb began, but she held up her hand. "I know," she said simply, "about you and Isabel. I don't know how long it's been going on, or exactly what it means, but I know." Caleb's shoulders sagged, as if he'd been holding his breath for days and could finally exhale. "How did you—" "The way you look at each other, the way she looks at you, the way you both seem so comfortable together, like you've shared things I'm not part of." Charlotte kept her voice steady,
though she felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff. "I'm right, aren't I?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and Charlotte could see him struggling with how much to admit, how much truth she was ready for. "Yes," he said finally. "You're right. I'm sorry, Charlotte. I didn't want you to find out like this." The words hit her like a physical blow, even though she'd been preparing for them. Hearing the confirmation made it real in a way that speculation hadn't. "How long?" she asked. "It started about 2 months ago. We were friends first, and then things changed." "Do you love her?" Another long pause, and Charlotte could see the answer in his face before he spoke. "Yes. I think I do." The party continued around them, but Charlotte felt like she was standing in a bubble of silence, separated from the world by the weight of this moment. Everything she'd planned, everything she'd hoped for during these 3 months in Paris was crumbling around her. But underneath the pain, she was surprised to find something else. Relief. The uncertainty that had been eating at her for days was finally over. She knew where she stood now. "What happens now?" she asked. Caleb looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "I don't know. I never meant for this to happen, Charlotte. When I left Illinois, I thought we could make it work. I thought distance was just geography. But it's not." "No, it's not." He paused, then said, "You could stay in Paris anyway, finish your program. We could try to be friends." Charlotte almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Friends? Caleb, I flew across an ocean to be with you. I can't just downshift to friendship like changing gears in a car." "Then what do you want to do?" It was a fair question, and Charlotte realized she didn't have an answer. What did she want to do? Go home to Chicago with her tail between her legs? Stay in Paris and torture herself by watching Caleb build a life with someone else? Pretend that nothing had changed and try to win him back? None of those options felt right. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know I can't stand here and pretend to enjoy this party anymore." She started to leave, then turned back. For what it's worth, she seems lovely, intelligent, sophisticated, everything you'd want in a Parisian girlfriend. "Charlotte, I'm not being sarcastic. She does seem lovely. And maybe that makes this hurt less somehow. If you were leaving me for someone awful, I could hate her and make this about her character, but she's not awful, is she? She's probably perfect for the person you're becoming." Caleb's eyes filled with something that might have been tears. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know. But you did. And now we both have to figure out how to live with that." Charlotte made her way back through the party, retrieving her coat from the bedroom where it had been placed with the others. Isabel intercepted her near the door. "Leaving so soon? I hope you enjoyed the evening." Charlotte steadied her face, looking for signs of malice or triumph, but found only genuine concern and perhaps a touch of guilt. "It was very enlightening," Charlotte said carefully. "Thank you for including me." Isabel's expression suggested she understood the subtext. "Charlotte, I want you to know—" "It's fine," Charlotte interrupted. "Really, these things happen. Perhaps we could have coffee sometime. I know this must be difficult, and I thought perhaps we could talk." The offer was so unexpected, so genuinely kind that Charlotte felt her careful composure begin to crack. This woman, who had every reason to see Charlotte as a threat or an obstacle, was extending an olive branch. "Maybe," Charlotte said. I'll think about it." The night air was cold against her face as she walked back towards her apartment, her heels clicking against the cobblestones in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. The party had been everything she'd expected Parisian intellectual life to be: sophisticated, engaging, full of beautiful people having meaningful conversations. and she'd never felt more out of place in her life. Not because she wasn't smart enough or cultured enough, but because she was the wrong person in the wrong story. Caleb belonged in that world, with those people, with Isabel. Charlotte could see it now with painful clarity, how much more himself he seemed here, how naturally he fit into this sophisticated international milieu.
Back in her small apartment, Charlotte sat by the window and tried to make sense of what she was feeling. Betrayal, certainly, hurt and disappointment, and the peculiar humiliation that comes from having your private hopes exposed as naive. But there was something else, something she hadn't expected, a strange sense of liberation. For months, she'd been trying to maintain a relationship across an ocean, trying to keep alive something that had perhaps already died. Now she knew for certain that it was over. She could stop trying to resurrect it. The question was, what came next? Charlotte pulled out her sketchbook and began to draw. Not the view from her window or memories of home, but something abstract, lines and shapes that suggested movement, change, the way things fell apart and reformed into new configurations. As she drew, she felt something shifting inside her, a reorientation that was painful but also strangely exciting. She was in Paris, alone, hurt, with 3 months stretching ahead of her and no clear plan for how to fill them. But she was also free in a way she hadn't been since arriving. Free from the obligation to fit into someone else's life, free to discover who she might become when she wasn't trying to be half of a couple. Outside her window, the city continued its ancient rhythm, indifferent to one more story of love lost and found and lost again. But Charlotte found comfort in that indifference. Paris had seen countless broken hearts, countless new beginnings. It would hold space for hers as well. She drew until the early hours of the morning, until her hand ached and her eyes burned with fatigue, but when she finally closed the sketchbook and prepared for bed, she felt something she hadn't felt since arriving in Paris, like herself again. Tomorrow she would begin the process of rebuilding. Tonight, she would let herself grieve for the future she had imagined and would never have. Part V. A quiet night in Paris. The 3 days following the salon party passed in a haze of deliberate solitude. Charlotte had turned off her phone after the 15th text from Caleb, each message a variation on the themes of apology, explanation, and awkward attempts to salvage something from the wreckage of their relationship. She spent her time walking through Paris like a ghost, visiting museums and galleries with the methodical thoroughness of someone trying to exhaust herself into numbness. The Musée d'Orsay, the Centre Pompidou, the intimate galleries of the Marais, she absorbed art with a hunger that felt desperate, as if beauty might serve as an antidote to heartbreak. But it was during her 3rd sleepless night that Charlotte discovered the particular magic of Paris in the hours after midnight. She'd given up trying to sleep around 2 a.m., her mind churning with fragments of conversation from the party, images of Caleb and Isabel together, plans and possibilities that kept reshaping themselves like patterns in a kaleidoscope. Instead of lying in bed torturing herself, she dressed and slipped out into the empty streets. The Paris she found waiting for her was entirely different from the daytime city she'd been exploring. The tourist crowds had vanished, the cafe terraces were empty, and the streets belonged to shift workers, insomniacs, and the occasional couple walking home from late dinners. The city's bones showed more clearly without the flesh of daily activity to obscure them. The architecture seemed more pronounced, the history more present. Charlotte walked without destination, letting her feet carry her through neighborhoods she'd only seen on maps. The Latin Quarter was quiet except for the occasional late-night cafe still serving coffee to students cramming for exams. The Ile Saint-Louis felt like a village suspended in time, its narrow streets empty except for the sound of her footsteps on cobblestones that had been walked for centuries.
She found herself drawn to the Seine, following its curves as it wound through the heart of the city. The water looked black in the darkness, punctuated by the reflections of streetlights and the illuminated facades of famous buildings. Notre Dame rose before her like a prayer made of stone, its Gothic spires reaching toward a sky that held the last traces of urban light pollution. Charlotte had brought her sketchbook, and she found a bench along the quai where she could draw the cathedral silhouette. But as she worked, she realized she wasn't just drawing the building, she was capturing something about the quality of solitude she'd discovered, the way being alone in a beautiful place could feel like a conversation with something larger than herself. A jogger passed by, nodding to her with the camaraderie of fellow insomniacs. An elderly man walked a small dog that seemed as wide awake as its owner. These encounters felt precious in their brevity, moments of human connection that didn't require explanation or context. As she walked, Charlotte began to understand something about herself that she'd never fully recognized before. She'd been so focused on being part of a couple, on defining herself in relation to Caleb, that she'd forgotten how much she enjoyed her own company. In Illinois, she'd spent countless hours alone in her studio or walking through the fields, but she'd always thought of those times as preparation for something else, for sharing her discoveries with Caleb, for creating art that would connect her to others. But here, now, walking through sleeping Paris with no one to share her observations with, Charlotte felt a different kind of completeness. The city was revealing itself to her in its most intimate state, and she was receiving those revelations as herself alone, not as half of anything. She walked until sunrise began to tint the eastern sky, then found an all-night cafe near Le Hall, where she ordered coffee and a croissant from a sleepy barista who looked like he'd been working since the previous evening. The cafe was filled with the kind of people who inhabited cities at that liminal hour, night shift workers ending their day, early risers beginning theirs, people like herself who existed in the spaces between normal schedules. Charlotte pulled out her phone and finally looked at Caleb's messages. Most were variations on the same themes: apologies, explanations, requests to talk. But the most recent one, sent just an hour earlier, was different. I know you're not ready to talk, and I understand that. But I want you to know that I never intended for any of this to happen the way it did. You deserve so much better than what I've given you. I hope you'll stay in Paris and make the most of your time here. You were always braver than I was. C. There was something final about the message, a sense of closure that the others had lacked. Charlotte read it twice, then put her phone away without responding. As the cafe began to fill with the morning crowd, Charlotte felt herself becoming self-conscious about her solitude. The easy anonymity of the night hours was giving way to the social expectations of day when being alone in public required more explanation. She walked back to her apartment as the city awakened around her, watching shopkeepers unlock their doors and commuters emerge from metro stations. The transformation was remarkable. Within a space of a few hours, Paris had shifted from intimate to public, from secretive to performative.
Back in her small apartment, Charlotte felt the exhaustion of her sleepless night settling into her bones. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from genuine experience rather than restless anxiety. She'd discovered something important during her night walk, that she could be alone in a foreign city and feel not lonely, but complete. She slept until late afternoon, then woke to find a note slipped under her door. For a moment, her heart jumped, thinking it might be from Caleb. But the handwriting was unfamiliar, feminine, carefully formed. Dear Charlotte, I hope you don't mind my reaching out, but I wanted to follow up on our brief conversation at the party. I know the situation is difficult for everyone involved, and I thought perhaps we might find it helpful to talk, not about Caleb necessarily, but about other things. I am often at the cafe on Rue de Seine around 4 p.m. if you would like to join me. No pressure, of course. Kindly, Isabel. Charlotte stared at the note for several minutes, trying to decide what to make of it.
The offer was generous, particularly given the circumstances. Most women in Isabel's position would probably prefer to avoid the uncomfortable complications of befriending their lover's ex-girlfriend. But then again, Isabel wasn't most women. Everything about her suggested someone who approached difficult situations with directness and grace rather than avoidance. Charlotte found herself curious despite her emotional exhaustion. What would it be like to talk to the woman who had inadvertently dismantled her carefully laid plans? What could they possibly have to say to each other? She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt like armor. Well-fitted jeans, a soft sweater that made her feel confident, and boots that were practical but elegant. If she was going to have what was potentially the most awkward conversation of her life, she wanted to feel as much like herself as possible. The cafe on Rue de Seine was exactly the kind of place Charlotte had expected. Small, intimate, with mismatched vintage furniture and walls covered in local artwork. Isabel was sitting at a corner table, reading a book and nursing what looked like her second or third coffee of the afternoon. She looked up as Charlotte approached, her face lighting with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Charlotte, I wasn't sure you would come." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please, sit. Would you like coffee? Something to eat?" Charlotte ordered a café au lait and settled into the chair, trying to read Isabel's expression for signs of discomfort or ulterior motives. But if Isabel felt awkward about the situation, she hid it well. "I wanted to apologize," Isabel said once Charlotte's coffee arrived, "for the party, for the way you found out about everything. It must have been very difficult." "It wasn't your fault," Charlotte replied, surprised by her own equanimity. "I mean, this situation is what it is. You didn't create it by having a party." "Perhaps not, but I could have handled things differently. I could have encouraged Caleb to be more honest with you from the beginning." Charlotte studied Isabel's face, noting the genuine concern in her expression. "Would you have? If you were me, if someone you cared about was involved with someone else, would you really want to know immediately? Or would you rather live in ignorance a little longer?" Isabel considered this, her fingers tracing patterns on the table surface. I think I would want to know. Uncertainty is often worse than painful truth." "That's very rational of you." "You think I am too rational?" "No, I think you're probably right. I've spent the last few days thinking about it, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. This was probably inevitable. Caleb and I, we were holding on to something that had already changed. Maybe it needed to end this way." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching other patrons come and go. Charlotte found herself studying Isabel more closely, trying to understand what had attracted Caleb to her, beyond the obvious attributes of intelligence and beauty. There was a quality of presence about her that Charlotte recognized, the ability to be fully engaged with whatever was happening in the moment, whether it was a conversation, a book, or simply the act of drinking coffee. It was similar to something Charlotte had always admired in Caleb, the capacity for complete attention. "Can I ask you something? How did it happen? Between you and Caleb, I mean. I'm not trying to torture myself, I'm just curious about how these things develop." Isabel looked surprised by the question, but she didn't deflect it. "We were friends first for several weeks. Study partners, really. We were both working on projects about cultural identity, and we discovered we had similar perspectives. Then one evening, we went to see a film together, and afterwards we walked along the Seine talking about it, and the rest is history?" Something like that. But Charlotte, you should know. He talked about you constantly, especially in the beginning. He felt terrible about his feelings for me, about what they meant for your relationship. This was not easy for him. Charlotte found this strangely comforting. At least her heartbreak wasn't casual, a footnote in someone else's love story. What's he like here? In Paris, I mean. Is he different from what you might expect? Isabel smiled, and for the first time, Charlotte caught a glimpse of the expression she'd seen on her face when she looked at Caleb at the party. He is more confident here, I think. More willing to take intellectual risks. In your America, perhaps he felt he had to be a certain kind of person, practical, grounded. Here, he allows himself to be more philosophical, perhaps, more interested in ideas for their own sake rather than for what they might accomplish. I sense that change in him. The way he seemed more expansive in his thinking, more comfortable with ambiguity and complexity. That sounds like the person he always wanted to be. Even in high school, he was drawn to big ideas, but he felt like he had to justify them somehow, make them practical. They talked for another hour, and Charlotte found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation. Isabel was intelligent without being pretentious, thoughtful without being overly serious. She asked perceptive questions about Charlotte's art and seemed genuinely interested in her perspective on American culture and education. Most surprisingly, Charlotte found herself liking her. It would have been easier if Isabel had been awful, vain, or shallow, or cruel. Then Charlotte could have made Caleb's choice about poor judgment or temporary infatuation. But Isabel was exactly the kind of person Charlotte herself would want to be friends with under different circumstances. As they prepared to leave, Isabel hesitated, then said, "Charlotte, I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous, but I think you should know what happened between Caleb and me. It doesn't diminish what you two had. He spoke of your relationship with such respect, such genuine love. Sometimes people grow in different directions, and that doesn't make their shared history less valuable." Charlotte felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time since the party. "Thank you for saying that. And thank you for this, for suggesting we talk. It helps somehow, knowing that you're a good person. It makes the whole situation feel less arbitrary." They parted ways on Rue de Seine, and Charlotte walked home through streets that were beginning to fill with evening commuters. She felt lighter somehow, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. That night, she called her mother. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" "Better than I expected," Charlotte said, and realized it was true. "I met her today, the other woman, Isabel." "Oh, honey, how was that?" "Surprisingly good, actually. She's lovely, which somehow makes it easier to accept, if that makes sense." "It does make sense. It means Caleb didn't leave you for someone unworthy. He just found someone who fits the person he's becoming better than you do." "Exactly." Charlotte paused, looking out her window at the courtyard where someone had hung laundry that fluttered in the evening breeze. "Mom, I think I want to stay." "In Paris?" "Yes, not to try to win him back or anything like that, but for me. I have 2.5 months left in the program, and I'm starting to understand that this trip was never really about Caleb. It was about discovering who I am when I'm not defined by my relationship with him." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "That sounds very wise and very brave." "I don't feel brave. I feel scared and sad and completely uncertain about what comes next. But I also feel alive, like I'm finally paying attention to my own life instead of just reacting to someone else's choices." After they hung up, Charlotte made herself dinner with ingredients she'd bought from the local market. Fresh bread, cheese, wine, simple things that tasted better here than similar items did at home. She ate by her window, watching the life of the courtyard unfold below her, and felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving in Paris: contentment. She was alone in a foreign city, recently heartbroken, with no clear plan for the future. By most measures, her situation could be seen as precarious at best, but sitting there with her simple meal and her view of ordinary Parisian life, Charlotte felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. Later that evening, she finally responded to Caleb's last message. "Thank you for your honesty. Even though it came later than I wished, I am staying in Paris for the rest of my program. Not for you, but for me. I hope you'll both be happy together. And I hope someday we can remember the good parts of what we had without too much pain. Take care of yourself. C." After sending the message, she turned off her phone and set up her easel by the window. The courtyard was lit by a single lamp, casting everything in a warm, golden glow that reminded her of the light in old paintings. She began to paint, not copying what she saw, but responding to it, layers of color that suggested solitude and peace, movement and stillness, ending and beginning. As she worked, she felt herself settling into a rhythm that was entirely her own, uninfluenced by anyone else's expectations or needs. For the first time since arriving in Paris, Charlotte felt like she was exactly where she belonged.
Warm. Part 6. Morning becomes herself. 3 weeks later, Charlotte had established a routine that felt entirely her own. She woke early, before the city fully awakened, and painted by her window while drinking coffee that had become consistently better as she learned the preferences of different neighborhood cafes. She discovered that Paris in the morning light was different from Paris at any other time, softer, more forgiving, full of possibilities that hadn't yet been narrowed by the day's realities. Her French had improved dramatically out of necessity. Without Caleb to translate or navigate for her, she'd been forced to engage directly with shopkeepers, museum guards, fellow students in her art workshops. The language was coming to her not as academic exercise, but as living tool, shaped by need and repetition, and the particular pleasure of being understood in a tongue that wasn't her native one. The European art workshop had proved more challenging and rewarding than she'd expected. Her instructor, Madame Dubois, was a former gallery owner with exacting standards and a gift for pushing students beyond their comfort zones. Under her guidance, Charlotte had begun experimenting with techniques she'd never considered: mixed media installations, performance art, conceptual pieces that required her to think about art as communication rather than mere representation. "Art is not about making pretty pictures," Madame Dubois had said during Charlotte's first critique, examining a landscape Charlotte had painted of the Luxembourg Gardens. "It is about saying something that cannot be said in any other way. What are you trying to tell us with this piece?" Charlotte had struggled to articulate an answer that went beyond, "I thought it was beautiful." But over the subsequent weeks, she'd begun to understand what Madame Dubois meant. Art was a language, and she was still learning its vocabulary. Her latest project was a series she'd begun calling Solitude Studies, paintings that explored the difference between loneliness and chosen solitude, between isolation and independence. They were more abstract than anything she'd done before, layers of color and texture that suggested emotional states rather than depicting literal scenes. The work was deeply personal, drawing from her experiences over the past month, but it was also something larger, an exploration of what it meant to be alone in a world designed for pairs and groups and families. On this particular March morning, Charlotte was preparing for something she'd been avoiding since her conversation with Isabel 3 weeks earlier, a return to her old neighborhood in the 5th arrondissement, where she might encounter Caleb. She'd been successfully avoiding him, which in a city the size of Paris required some strategic planning but wasn't impossible. She knew his schedule, his preferred cafes, the routes he took to classes. Paris was large enough to contain two people who didn't want to see each other, provided they were both willing to make the effort. But today she had a specific destination in mind, a small gallery in the Latin Quarter that was featuring an exhibition on contemporary American art. Margot had mentioned it, suggesting that Charlotte might find it interesting to see how American artists were represented in European galleries. The exhibition was everything Margot had promised: thoughtful, well-curated, featuring artists Charlotte recognized alongside others that she'd never encountered. She was studying a piece that reminded her of her own recent work when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "The composition is interesting, but I think the color palette is too safe. American art often suffers from this problem: technical skill without emotional risk." Charlotte turned to find a young man about her age, dark hair and intelligent eyes, speaking to a companion in an accented English. He had the look of a graduate student, slightly rumpled clothes, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of intense focus that came from spending too much time thinking about abstract concepts. "I disagree," his companion was saying. "The restraint is intentional. It's about finding power in subtlety rather than drama." Charlotte found herself drawn into their conversation despite her initial instinct to remain anonymous. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm curious about your perspective on American art. Do you really think it lacks emotional risk?" The young man turned to her with interest. "Ah, an American. Perfect. You can settle our argument." He smiled, and Charlotte noticed that his eyes crinkled at the corners in a way that suggested he smiled often. "I am Antoine, and this is my friend Marie. We are both students at the École des Beaux-Arts." "Charlotte, I'm here with a workshop program, studying painting." "Excellent. So you can give us the American perspective. Do you think your countrymen are too conservative in their artistic expression?" Charlotte considered the question seriously. "I think Americans often feel pressure to justify art in practical terms, to make it accessible, commercial, easily understood. Maybe that does lead to a kind of conservatism, but I've also seen American artists take incredible risks, create work that's completely revolutionary." "Yes, but those are exceptions, no? The mainstream of American art is very, safe." "Maybe, but I'm not sure that's necessarily a criticism. Sometimes subtle work can be more powerful than dramatic work. Sometimes emotional risk looks like restraint rather than explosion." Antoine's eyebrows rose with interest. "Now that is an intriguing idea. Can you give an example?" Charlotte thought of her own recent work, of the way she'd been trying to capture complex emotions through layers of color rather than obvious symbolism. "Well, think about how you represent heartbreak in art. You could paint someone crying, or you could paint empty spaces, negative space that suggests absence. The second approach might seem more restrained, but it requires the viewer to engage more actively. The emotion is there, but you have to work to find it." Marie nodded approvingly. "I like this perspective. Art as collaboration between artist and viewer." They continued talking for another 20 minutes, moving through the gallery together as they debated different pieces and artistic movements. Charlotte found herself energized by the conversation in a way she hadn't experienced since arriving in Paris. These were people who took ideas seriously, who engaged with art as something vital rather than decorative. "You must come to our seminar next week," Antoine said, as they prepared to leave the gallery.
We meet every Wednesday evening at a cafe in Montparnasse to discuss contemporary art. Very informal, just students and a few professors who enjoy arguing about aesthetics. I'd love to, Charlotte said, and realized she meant it. As she walked home through the afternoon light, Charlotte reflected on how different this interaction had felt from her early experiences in Paris. 3 weeks ago, she would have been conscious of herself as Caleb's girlfriend, would have seen the conversation through the lens of how it related to her primary identity as part of a couple. But today, she'd engaged as herself alone, as an artist, a thinker, someone with her own perspectives worth sharing. The change was subtle but significant. She was becoming someone new, or perhaps she was becoming someone who had always existed but had been obscured by the roles and relationships that had defined her for so long. That evening, Charlotte worked on a new painting while rain drummed against her window. The canvas was larger than anything she'd attempted in her small apartment, requiring her to work in sections, stepping back frequently to assess the overall composition. The piece was emerging as something entirely different from her previous work, bolder, more confident, willing to take the kind of emotional risks she'd been discussing with Antoine and Marie. She was layering paint in thick impasto strokes, building texture that demanded attention rather than inviting quiet contemplation. As she worked, she found herself thinking about transformation, not just her own, but the way people changed when they encountered new environments, new challenges, new ways of seeing themselves. The Charlotte who had left Chicago 3 months ago felt like a different person from the woman who now stood in this Paris apartment, covered in paint and completely absorbed in her work. Her phone rang, interrupting her concentration. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "How's my favorite expatriate artist?" "Getting paint in my hair and loving every minute of it." "That sounds promising. Very different from the last time we talked." "Everything's different now. I feel like I'm finally inhabiting my own life instead of just visiting it." "That's beautiful and slightly cryptic. What does it mean in practical terms?" Charlotte set down her brush and gave Sarah her full attention. "It means I'm not just killing time until I can go home. I'm building something here. Friendships, artwork, a version of myself that I didn't know existed. Today, I had this amazing conversation with some art students about American aesthetics, and I realized I have opinions about things I've never thought about before." "You've always had opinions, honey. Maybe you're just in a place where you feel free to express them." "Maybe. Or maybe being forced to define myself independently without reference to Caleb or our relationship has made me discover parts of myself that were dormant." "How do you feel about him now, when you think about what happened?" Charlotte considered the question while staring at her painting in progress. "Grateful, honestly, which is strange because it still hurts sometimes. But if he hadn't fallen in love with someone else, I might have spent these 3 months trying to be a good girlfriend instead of learning to be a complete person." "That's very mature of you. Or very good at rationalization," Charlotte laughed. "Either way, it's working for me." After they hung up, Charlotte continued painting until well past midnight, losing herself in the rhythm of brush against canvas, in the way colors mixed and evolved under her hands. When she finally stepped back to assess her work, she felt a surge of excitement that had nothing to do with external validation. This was good work. Not perfect, but authentic, bold, uniquely hers. She was cleaning her brushes when she heard footsteps in the courtyard below, accompanied by familiar voices speaking French. Through her window, she could see Caleb walking with Isabel, their arms linked, both of them laughing about something as they headed toward the building's entrance. For a moment, she felt the old stab of pain, the reflex of loss that had dominated her first weeks in Paris. But underneath it, she was surprised to discover something else, a kind of detached curiosity. They looked happy together, compatible in ways that she and Caleb perhaps had never been. Isabel's sophisticated confidence complemented Caleb's intellectual intensity, while Charlotte's artistic sensitivity had sometimes felt overwhelming to him, requiring more emotional labor than he was prepared to invest. She watched them disappear into the building and felt something release in her chest. Not the acute pain of fresh heartbreak, but the gentler melancholy of a chapter definitely closed. The next morning, Charlotte woke with unusual energy and purpose. She had a plan forming, something she'd been considering for several days without quite admitting it to herself. She dressed carefully and walked to the 7th arrondissement, to the cafe where she'd had her conversation with Isabel weeks ago. It was a Thursday, and she wasn't sure if Isabel would be there, but she'd noticed during their previous meeting that this seemed to be Isabel's regular spot for afternoon coffee and reading. She was in luck. Isabel was at the same corner table, absorbed in what looked like a philosophy text, a half-empty cup cooling beside her. "Isabel." She looked up, startled, then smiled with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Charlotte! What a lovely surprise. Please sit."
Charlotte settled into the chair across from her, suddenly uncertain about what she wanted to say. "I wanted to thank you," she began, "for our conversation last month. It helped me process everything in a way that let me move forward." "I am glad to hear that. You look well, different somehow, more settled." "I feel different, stronger, I think, more like myself." Charlotte paused, then said what she'd come to say. "I also wanted to apologize." "Apologize? For what?" "For being angry with you, even though I tried not to show it. For blaming you for something that wasn't really your fault. For seeing you as the other woman, instead of just as a person who fell in love." Isabel's expression softened. "Charlotte, you had every right to be angry. Your feelings were completely understandable." "Maybe, but they weren't fair to you. And I realized recently that carrying that resentment was hurting me more than anyone else." They ordered fresh coffee and talked for an hour about art and philosophy and the challenges of being young women trying to define themselves in a world that offered so many conflicting messages about what they should want and who they should become. Charlotte found herself genuinely enjoying Isabel's company, appreciating her intelligence and thoughtfulness without the complication of rivalry or hurt feelings. When they parted ways, Charlotte felt lighter, as if she'd set down a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. Walking home through the Luxembourg Gardens, Charlotte stopped to sketch the afternoon light filtering through the bare branches of the trees. As she drew, she found herself thinking about forgiveness, not as a grand gesture or a moral obligation, but as a practical decision, a choice to stop carrying pain that no longer served any purpose. She'd forgiven Caleb, she realized, not because what he'd done was acceptable, but because holding on to anger required energy that she wanted to spend on other things. She'd forgiven Isabel, who had done nothing wrong except fall in love with someone who wasn't entirely free to be loved. Most importantly, she'd begun to forgive herself for being naive, for building expectations based on insufficient information, for the way she'd initially defined her entire Paris experience in terms of her relationship rather than her own growth and discovery. That evening, Charlotte attended her first meeting of Antoine's art discussion group. The café in Montparnasse was exactly what she'd expected, dimly lit, crowded with students and professors, filled with the kind of passionate debate that could only happen when intelligent people disagreed about things that mattered to them. The topic for the evening was the relationship between art and politics, and Charlotte found herself drawn into discussions that challenged everything she thought she knew about the purpose and responsibility of artistic expression. Art cannot be separated from politics.
argued one of the professors, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and paint-stained fingers. Every choice an artist makes, subject matter, medium, venue, is inherently political. But must art serve political ends to be valuable? Countered Antoine. What about beauty for its own sake? What about work that seeks to transcend political categories? Charlotte listened for most of the evening, absorbing perspectives she'd never encountered, feeling her understanding of art and its possibilities expand with each new viewpoint. When she finally contributed to the conversation, it was to defend the political value of apparently apolitical work. Maybe the most radical thing an artist can do sometimes is insist on the importance of interior experience, of private emotion, in a world that wants to reduce everything to public positions. Personal truth can be political truth when it's honest about experiences that society tries to suppress or ignore. The comments sparked 20 minutes of heated debate, and Charlotte felt the exhilarating rush of intellectual engagement that had been missing from her life for too long. As the evening wound down and the group began to disperse, Antoine approached her. "Your comment about personal truth being political, that was very insightful. Have you read Adrienne Rich? I think you would find her essays on poetry and politics very interesting." "I haven't, but I'll look for them." "Better yet, I have the book. Would you like to borrow it? We could discuss it over coffee sometime." Charlotte felt a flutter of something that might have been romantic interest, then pushed it away. It was too soon, she wasn't ready, she needed more time to discover who she was outside of romantic relationships. But then she looked at Antoine's face, kind, intelligent, genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than her availability, and realized that maybe the timing of connections wasn't something she could control or should worry about. Maybe the point was simply to remain open to whatever possibilities presented themselves. "I'd like that," she said. Walking home through the Paris streets that had become familiar and comfortable, Charlotte reflected on how much her life had changed in the space of just a few weeks. She had friends now, intellectual stimulation, work that excited her, a sense of purpose that existed independently of anyone else's validation or approval. The heartbreak that had brought her to this point was still there, woven into the fabric of who she was becoming, but it no longer defined her experience. Instead, it had become one thread among many, and a tapestry that was growing richer and more complex with each passing day. Back in her apartment, Charlotte stood before her easel and looked at the painting she'd been working on the night before. In the light of her evening's conversations, she could see new possibilities in the composition, ways to push the work further, to take greater risks in service of greater honesty. She picked up her brush and began to paint, adding layers of color and meaning that reflected not just where she'd been, but where she was going. Outside her window, Paris settled into its nighttime rhythm, and Charlotte worked with the focused concentration of someone who had finally learned to trust her own vision. For the first time since arriving in the city, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged, not because of anyone else, but because she had chosen to be there, had earned her place through her own courage and curiosity and willingness to grow. The woman painting by that window was not the same person who had stepped off the plane at Charles de Gaulle Airport 2 months earlier. That woman had been half of something, defined by what she lacked in someone else's absence. This woman was complete unto herself, ready for whatever adventures awaited someone brave enough to embrace solitude as a form of freedom rather than a burden to be endured.
Warm epilogue 6 months later. Charlotte stood in the main gallery of a small but prestigious exhibition space in the Marais, watching people examine her paintings with the kind of focused attention she'd once reserved for other artists' work. The opening reception for Solitude Studies, an American Artist's Paris, was exceeding all her expectations, not just in attendance, but in the quality of engagement her work was generating. Madame Dubois approached, carrying 2 glasses of wine and wearing an expression of satisfied pride. "Your work has matured remarkably in these past months," she said, handing Charlotte a glass. "These pieces, they speak with a voice that is entirely your own." Charlotte accepted the compliment with the grace she'd learned from watching Isabel navigate social situations, present and grateful, but not diminished by the need for external validation. "Thank you. I couldn't have developed this work without the foundation you helped me build." Across the gallery, she spotted Antoine engaged in animated discussion with a collector who had been asking detailed questions about her technique. Their friendship had evolved slowly over the spring months. Coffee conversations about art and philosophy, long walks through different neighborhoods, and easy companionship that felt sustainable rather than desperate. They'd kissed for the first time just 2 weeks earlier, outside a cinema in Montparnasse, after watching a retrospective of Agnes Varda films. It had been gentle and tentative, both of them aware that Charlotte was still healing from her previous relationship, both committed to letting whatever was developing between them unfold at its own pace. "Charlotte Morrison?" She turned to find a woman about her mother's age, elegantly dressed with the kind of understated confidence that suggested both success and good taste. "Yes?" "I'm Catherine Beaumont, from Galerie Beaumont. I wondered if we might speak privately about your work." Charlotte's pulse quickened. Galerie Beaumont was one of the most respected contemporary art galleries in Paris, known for launching the careers of significant artists. She'd researched every gallery in the city during her application process for various exhibitions, and Beaumont had been on her list of impossible dreams. They found a quiet corner where Catherine could speak without being overheard. "Your work demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of color and composition, but what interests me more is the conceptual framework. You found a way to make personal experience speak to universal themes without losing either specificity or resonance." "Thank you. That was exactly what I was hoping to achieve." "I'd like to propose something. We're planning an exhibition for next spring, New Voices, International Perspectives on Contemporary Solitude. I think your work would fit perfectly, and I'd love to discuss the possibility of representing you more broadly." Charlotte felt the world tilt slightly, the way it had that morning when she decided to come to Paris, when she'd realized Caleb was in love with someone else, when she'd first understood that she could build a life entirely of her own choosing. "I would be very interested in discussing that," she managed. After Catherine moved on to speak with other artists, Charlotte stood in her corner for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. 6 months ago, she'd been a heartbroken student whose primary identity was as someone's girlfriend. Tonight, she was being courted by one of the most important galleries in Paris. The transformation felt surreal, but also inevitable. The natural result of months of focused work, emotional growth, and the kind of authentic self-discovery that could only happen when external supports were stripped away. "Congratulations." Warm. Charlotte turned to find Caleb standing a few feet away, looking nervous but genuinely pleased. She hadn't seen him since that night in the courtyard months earlier, though she'd heard from mutual acquaintances that he and Isabel were doing well, that he'd decided to extend his stay in Paris and apply for graduate programs. "Thank you," she said, and was surprised to find that seeing him caused no emotional turbulence, just a mild curiosity about what he wanted to say. "Your work is incredible, really sophisticated, emotionally honest. I always knew you were talented, but this," he gestured toward the gallery, "this is something else entirely." "I had good teachers and plenty of material to work with," she added with a slight smile. Caleb had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Charlotte, I owe you an apology, not just for how things ended with us, but for the way I handled the whole situation. You deserved better." "You're right, I did. But honestly, Caleb, I'm grateful for how everything worked out. If you hadn't fallen in love with Isabel,
I might never have discovered who I am when I'm not trying to be half of something else. They talked for a few more minutes, carefully, politely, like former neighbors who had shared a fence but lived completely separate lives. When Caleb excused himself to rejoin Isabel across the gallery, Charlotte felt nothing more than a mild satisfaction at having handled the encounter with dignity. Antoine appeared at her elbow, carrying fresh wine and wearing the slightly dazed expression of someone who had spent the evening in stimulating conversation. "How are you holding up? This must be overwhelming." "It is, but in the best possible way." Charlotte leaned against him slightly, enjoying the solid warmth of his presence. "I keep thinking about something you said once about how the most meaningful art requires the artist to risk being completely seen. Tonight feels like the culmination of that risk." "And how does it feel, being completely seen?" Charlotte looked around the gallery at her paintings, at the people engaging seriously with work she'd created from her most vulnerable experiences, at the life she'd built through a combination of intention and accident, courage and necessity. "It feels like coming home, not to a place, but to myself." As the evening wound down and the gallery began to empty, Charlotte found herself standing alone before the centerpiece of the exhibition, a large canvas that captured the view from her apartment window on that first morning after learning the truth about Caleb and Isabel. The painting showed the courtyard in early light, but layered with transparent washes that suggested memory, possibility, the way the past and future could coexist in a single moment of perfect presence. She'd titled it Becoming, and looking at it now, Charlotte understood that the process it depicted was ongoing. The woman she'd discovered in Paris was not a final destination, but a starting point, a foundation stable enough to support whatever came next. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Saw the photos Sarah posted online. So proud of you, sweetheart. When do we get to see the show in person?" Charlotte smiled, typing back, "Soon. I'm thinking about organizing a show in Chicago next year. Time to bring what I've learned here back home." But even as she wrote the words, Charlotte knew that home had become more complex than geography. She carried Illinois with her in the way she noticed light and landscape, but Paris had taught her things about herself that could only be learned in the process of starting over, of building identity from scratch in a place where no one knew her history or expected her to be anyone particular. She was an American artist living in Paris, a daughter of the Midwest who had learned to speak French and think in colors that didn't exist in the familiar palette of her childhood. She was someone who had survived heartbreak and discovered it could be fertile ground for growth rather than just an experience to be endured. As Antoine helped her pack up the leftover wine and promotional materials from the reception, Charlotte felt the quiet satisfaction that came from work well done, risks taken and rewarded, a future that stretched ahead filled with possibility rather than predetermined outcomes. Tomorrow, she would begin planning for the Galerie Beaumont exhibition, would start thinking about which new pieces to create and how to push her work even further. Tomorrow, she would continue the ongoing project of becoming whoever she was meant to be. But tonight, walking through the quiet streets of Paris with Antoine, Charlotte felt the deep contentment that came from being exactly where she belonged, not because someone else had brought her there, but because she had chosen it for herself, had earned it through her own courage and curiosity and willingness to embrace solitude as a form of freedom rather than a problem to be solved. The city lights reflected off the wet cobblestones, and Charlotte sketched the scene in her mind, already planning how she might capture this moment of perfect balance between solitude and companionship, between who she had been and who she was still becoming. She was Charlotte Morrison, artist, Paris resident, woman complete unto herself and ready for whatever adventures await someone brave enough to trust her own vision. And that, she thought, as they turned on to her familiar street, was exactly who she had come to find.